I had been working late that night, picking up deliveries around Portland, trying to make enough to cover rent. It was one of those slow, rainy nights where the roads were empty and most people were home, probably binging some show or sleeping. Just as I was about to log off for the night, a new order popped up on my screen. It was odd. No restaurant name, just an address in Forest Park. The payout was unusually high, which was enough to make me ignore the weirdness and accept it. The drive there was unsettling. The further I got from downtown, the fewer streetlights there were. The roads twisted through thick trees, and the mist made everything look eerie. My GPS led me to a house at the end of a quiet, overgrown driveway. The place looked abandoned, windows boarded up, the front yard a mess of weeds and fallen branches. A single porch light flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows. Something about the place made my stomach tighten. I checked the app again. Same address, no cancellation. I called the listed number, but it rang until it went to voicemail. That should have been my cue to leave, but instead, I hesitated. Maybe the customer just didn't hear their phone. Maybe they were inside, waiting. Then, as if answering my unspoken question, a dim light flickered on upstairs. Someone was in there. Still uneasy, I grabbed the food bag and stepped out of the car. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. I knocked, the sound echoing through the empty night. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slow footsteps approached from the other side. The door opened slightly, revealing an elderly woman. Her face was lined with confusion, her eyes narrowing as she took me in. I explained I was delivering an order, but she only shook her head. She lived alone, she said, and hadn't ordered anything. A cold breeze passed through the doorway, making me shiver. Something didn't feel right. I apologized for the mix-up, turned back toward my car, and that's when I saw it. The bag of food. It was sitting on my passenger seat. I had been holding it just seconds ago, but now it was already inside the car, waiting for me. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at the bag like it might move on its own. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had absent-mindedly put it down before knocking. But I knew that wasn't true. I had been holding it. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I turned back to the house. The old woman was still there, watching me from the doorway, her expression unreadable. I wanted to ask if she had seen anything, but the words wouldn't come out. The longer I stood there, the heavier the air felt, like something unseen was pressing down on me. A sudden feeling of being watched crawled up my neck. My eyes flicked toward the second floor, toward the window where I had seen the light earlier. Someone was standing there, a dark silhouette, completely still, just watching. A cold, paralyzing fear settled in my chest. The figure didn't move. It didn't shift or react, just stood there, observing. I forced myself to move, yanking open my car door and sliding into the driver's seat. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my mind screaming at me to leave, but before I could even put the car in gear, my phone buzzed on the dashboard. A new message. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me not to, but I did anyway. Enjoy your meal, Mason. Drive safely. The blood drained from my face. My name. I had never given my name to the customer. It wasn't even listed on my profile, just my initials. I didn't think, I just drove. My tires kicked up gravel as I sped down the winding road, my headlights barely cutting through the fog. The road twisted and turned, and I forced myself not to check the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see. I needed to get away, fast. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spotted the warm glow of a gas station sign. It felt like a beacon of safety in the suffocating darkness. My hands were still shaking when I pulled in. I parked under the fluorescent lights, the hum of the overhead lamps grounding me in reality again. Only then did I dare to look back at the food bag. It was still there, untouched. I exhaled shakily and reached for it, hesitating before pulling it onto my lap. The smell of fried chicken and apples filled the car, warm and familiar, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't place. Then I noticed it. A small, crumpled piece of paper tucked inside the bag. I unfolded it with numb fingers, my pulse pounding in my ears. The note was written in shaky, uneven handwriting, like someone had scribbled it in a hurry. He watches from the upstairs window. Don't go back. The paper felt old, the edges yellowed and frayed, but that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. The ink, it wasn't fresh. It had been written a long time ago. And yet, the warning had come too late. I sat there in the gas station parking lot, gripping the note so tightly my fingers ached. My mind raced, trying to piece everything together, but none of it made sense. The food order, the abandoned house, the old woman, the shadow in the window, none of it fit into anything remotely logical. I checked the app again, half expecting the order to still be there, waiting for confirmation. But it was gone, like it had never existed. I needed to know more. Against every ounce of self-preservation screaming at me to just go home and forget it ever happened, I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't. I looked up the address. A few minutes of searching and my stomach dropped. The house had been abandoned for over 20 years. It used to belong to a man named Walter Delaney, a widower who had gone missing under bizarre circumstances. His wife had died years before him, and their only son had vanished when he was just a child. There were no reports of break-ins, no signs of struggle. Walter had simply disappeared, leaving his belongings behind like he had never left. The last known resident, an elderly woman, now deceased. My hands clenched around the steering wheel. The woman I had spoken to, she shouldn't have been there. I had to convince myself that I had just misread something, that I had gotten the wrong house. But deep down, I knew the truth. And then my phone buzzed again. A single notification. Next delivery available, accept. The address was the same one. I slammed my phone down so hard on the dashboard that the screen cracked. My heart pounded in my chest. No, absolutely not. I turned the key in the ignition, ready to put as much distance as I could between me and that house. But before I could drive off, something made me glance at the passenger seat one last time. The food bag. It was open now, and the box of fried chicken was completely empty. But I never touched it. I stared at it, the pit in my stomach growing. Then, just as I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the gas station parking lot, motionless, watching. And just like before, it never moved. I didn't stay to find out what would happen next. I drove, fast. I quit food delivery that night. I never went back. But sometimes late at night, my phone still buzzes. Next delivery available. Except, it's always the same address, and I never ever look at the window again. The night had stretched longer than expected, and exhaustion was already settling in when the last order popped up on my phone. It was supposed to be a simple drop-off, quick money before heading home. The address wasn't in town, but somewhere off Blue Ridge Parkway, a long, winding road that cut through the dense forests outside Asheville. The payout was higher than usual, probably because of the remote location, and despite a nagging feeling, I accepted it. The drive started out fine, just another routine delivery. But the further I went, the more isolated the surroundings became. Streetlights disappeared, and the only illumination came from my headlights, cutting through the thick fog that had settled along the road. The GPS struggled to keep up, constantly recalibrating, as if it couldn't decide where I was. At some point, I realized I hadn't passed another car in miles. It felt like I was driving straight into nowhere. When I finally reached the location, A small, worn-down cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by trees that loomed over it like silent watchers. The house looked abandoned, weathered wood, overgrown weeds, and a broken porch railing. The only sign of life was a single candle burning in the front window, its weak glow flickering against the darkness. There were no other lights, no cars in sight, nothing to suggest that someone actually lived there. Stepping out of the car, the cold hit harder than it should have for that time of year. The air felt unnaturally still, like the world was holding its breath. I knocked on the door, half hoping no one would answer so I could drop the food and leave. Silence. No movement inside. I checked my phone, and that's when I saw it. A message from the number attached to the order. "Come in. The door is open." A shiver crawled down my spine. The door didn't look open. In fact, it was shut tight, the paint peeling around the frame. Something about that message felt off, but I wasn't about to stick around to figure it out. I set the bag down on the porch, snapped a delivery confirmation photo, and turned back to my car. Before I could get in, an overwhelming sense of wrongness hit me. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The candle in the window flickered wildly before going out completely. The house was swallowed by darkness, and in that instant, something inside moved. Shadows stretched along the walls, shifting unnaturally, as if they had been waiting for the light to disappear. A creeping dread spread through my chest. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. Slamming the door shut, I started the engine and sped off, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. But the road ahead looked different. Instead of the turn I had taken to get there, the path stretched straight into the woods, lined with trees I didn't remember passing. The GPS had stopped working entirely, the estimated arrival time stuck on an endless loop. A thick fog curled along the asphalt, and with each passing second, the uneasy feeling that something was following me grew stronger. Then my phone buzzed. A new message. Same number. "You forgot something." My stomach twisted. I hadn't left anything behind. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and this time something was there. A faint silhouette in the back seat, barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I nearly swerved off the road. My foot slammed on the brakes, and the tires screeched against the pavement as the car veered dangerously close to the edge of the road. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine. I forced myself to turn around, to actually look at the back seat instead of just catching glimpses in the mirror. Nothing. The seat was empty, but the air inside the car felt different, heavier, like I wasn't alone. My breathing was shallow as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was just my brain playing tricks on me after that weird delivery. I didn't believe that. I gripped the steering wheel and pressed the gas, determined to get the hell out of there. The road should have led straight back to town, but something wasn't right. No matter how far I drove, the scenery stayed the same. Tall trees lining both sides, fog creeping in thick waves. It felt like I was driving in circles, even though I never turned the wheel. The clock on the dashboard wasn't moving. The time was frozen at 1:47 a.m. Then my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before looking. Don't leave yet. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to keep driving, to ignore whatever sick game this was. But the next moment, the car's headlights flickered, then shut off completely. For a split second, I was plunged into total darkness. The panic was instant. My fingers scrambled for the ignition, twisting the key over and over, but the engine refused to turn. The car was dead. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move outside. The same shadows from inside the cabin were spilling onto the road, stretching unnaturally toward the car. They weren't people. They weren't animals. They were just wrong, twisted, elongated forms that flickered in and out of sight as if they didn't belong to this world. The temperature inside dropped so fast that my breath turned to mist. A sharp, overwhelming sense of dread settled in, heavier than before. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate knocking on the passenger side window. I didn't look. I couldn't. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the ignition one last time, whispering every curse and prayer I could think of. The engine roared to life. The headlights flickered back on, cutting through the thickening fog, and in that brief moment of light, I finally saw what had been standing there. I wish I hadn't. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It had human-like features but distorted, as if someone had stretched its limbs and face into unnatural proportions. Hollow black eyes stared back at me, and its mouth, God, its mouth was too wide, a gaping void that looked like it could swallow the whole world. I didn't think, I just hit the gas. The car lurched forward, tires skidding against the wet pavement, and I didn't look back. Not at the shadows, not at whatever had been watching me. I just drove. And this time, the road changed. The endless stretch of trees finally gave way to streetlights, the fog breaking apart as I reached familiar roads. The moment I saw the first gas station, I pulled over and sat there, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My phone buzzed one last time. See you soon. My entire body went cold. I didn't check the sender. I didn't respond. I just wanted to forget. But forgetting wasn't that easy, because the next morning, when I checked my delivery history, the order was gone. The address didn't exist. No record, no receipt. Like it had never happened at all. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, flashes of the cabin, the candle, and those twisting shadows crept into my thoughts. The thing outside my car, the way it knocked like it was waiting for me to answer, it all felt too real to dismiss as exhaustion. By morning, I needed answers. Still running on adrenaline, I pulled up the delivery app and went straight to my order history. The last delivery should have been there, but it wasn't. No receipt, no details, no record that the order had ever existed. I tried searching for the address on Google Maps, but nothing came up, not even an unmarked road. It was as if I had driven into a place that didn't belong on any map. That didn't make sense. I knew I had been there. My tires had left tracks on the dirt road. My headlights had cut through the fog. My breath had frozen inside that car. I even checked local property records, thinking maybe I had stumbled onto an abandoned house. But the plot of land was listed as empty wilderness, untouched for decades. No structures, no listed owners. It should have ended there. I should have moved on, chalked it up to exhaustion or some kind of prank, but one last thing made sure I wouldn't. That night, as I got into my car for another shift, I smelled it. Candle wax, faint but unmistakable, like something had been inside my car and left its scent behind. And then my phone buzzed. A single message from a number with no name. We'll be waiting. I quit deliveries the next day, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The night had stretched longer than usual, and exhaustion weighed heavy on my shoulders as I wiped down the counter of the small diner in Flagstaff. The place had been quiet for hours, the hum of the neon sign outside the only sound breaking the silence. Just as I was about to clock out, a last-minute order popped up on my phone. The address sent a chill down my spine. Black Canyon Inn, a rundown motel off Route 66 that had been nothing more than a fading landmark for as long as I could remember. Deliveries to places like that never ended well. Either the person ordering was too drunk to find their wallet, or the tip was non-existent. But work was work, and my boss had made it clear. No rejecting orders. I sighed, grabbed the paper bag, and headed out into the cool night air. The drive was eerie. The stretch of road leading to the motel was almost completely dark, lined with towering trees that cast long, spindly shadows. The only signs of life were the occasional distant headlights of passing trucks. As I neared the motel, a dim, flickering sign buzzed weakly above the entrance. The place looked like it had been abandoned years ago. Paint peeled from the walls, weeds crept through the cracks in the pavement, and the reception windows were caked with dust. Stepping inside, I half expected to find someone behind the desk, but the lobby was empty. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. I glanced around, searching for any sign of movement, but nothing stirred. A single light flickered in the corner, casting erratic shadows against the walls. Pulling out my phone, I sent a quick message to the customer, letting them know I had arrived. The response came almost immediately. "I'm in room 13. Bring it up." A cold knot formed in my stomach. The numbers on the doors behind the desk only went up to 12. There was no room 13. Standing in the empty lobby, I stared at the message on my phone, hoping I had misread it. The hallway stretched out ahead, dimly lit, with doors on either side marked by tarnished brass numbers. 12 rooms, no 13. A sense of unease settled in my chest, but I tried to push it aside. Maybe the numbering was weird. Maybe the motel had a back section I couldn't see from here. Rational explanations always made things easier. Still, something about the air felt off. Heavy, like the weight of a place frozen in time. Deciding to at least check, I climbed the narrow stairs leading to the second floor. The carpet beneath my feet was stiff with age, the kind that probably hadn't been vacuumed in years. Each step creaked as I moved forward. The corridor was worse than the lobby, the smell of damp wood and stale air clinging to the walls. My fingers traced the numbers on the doors as I passed. 8, 9, 10. I slowed as I approached the end of the hall, expecting to find something, anything. But where room 13 should have been, there was only a blank stretch of wall. Confusion twisted into something sharper. I pulled out my phone and called the number from the order. The ringing echoed in my ear, but no one answered. Then, on the third ring, the call connected. A deep, uneven breathing filled the silence. I waited, my throat dry, but whoever was on the other end said nothing. The breathing continued, slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. Then, without warning, the call cut off. A chill ran down my spine, and my feet moved before my brain caught up. I turned back toward the stairs, nearly tripping over my own steps in my rush to leave. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I reached the lobby, shoving the exit door open and stepping into the night air. Sliding into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, the only familiar sound in the eerie stillness of the parking lot. Then, in the rear-view mirror, I saw it. A figure sat in the back seat, dark, motionless, its face barely visible in the dim light. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, but I was frozen, trapped between disbelief and pure terror. Then, in the fraction of a second it took for my mind to catch up, I whipped around, only to find the back seat completely empty. The shock sent a jolt through my system, and I did the only thing I could think of. My foot slammed against the gas pedal, and the car shot forward, tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove, the darkness swallowing the motel behind me. By the time I reached town, my hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I parked in front of the diner, the fluorescent lights buzzing above the entrance like nothing had happened. My heart was still hammering in my chest, but the world around me felt too normal, too indifferent to what I had just experienced. Inside, the familiar clatter of dishes and low hum of the radio should have been comforting, but instead, it made everything feel more surreal. I found Kevin behind the counter laughing at something on his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that I had nearly lost my mind just minutes earlier. I told him everything: the motel, the non-existent room, the call, the figure in my back seat. He raised an eyebrow and smirked, clearly amused. He thought I had let my imagination get the best of me. Maybe that I was just overtired. Creepy old motels always feel haunted, he said, dismissing it with a shrug. But then Bill, the diner's owner, stepped in from the back, wiping his hands on a stained rag. The second I mentioned Black Canyon Inn, his expression darkened. He didn't laugh. He didn't shrug it off. He told me that the motel had been shut down for years, ever since a man named Richard Calloway had brutally murdered his wife in what used to be room 13. The motel had been condemned after that, left to rot on the side of the highway. The room itself had been sealed up, its number erased, like they could erase what had happened inside. I felt sick. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The order had been real. The phone call had been real. And yet, room 13 didn't exist anymore. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I kept checking the reflection in the diner's windows, half expecting to see that shadowy figure staring back at me. But the restaurant was just as it always had been. Bright, warm, full of life. It wasn't until I got home, finally feeling safe enough to breathe again, that my phone buzzed with a new message. "Thanks for the delivery, come back tomorrow." The sender was the same unknown number. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I stared at the screen. I deleted the message immediately, but the weight of it remained, pressing down on my chest. I never went back to Black Canyon Inn, but somehow I knew that whatever had been there wasn't done with me yet. I used to deliver food every night, driving around Cleveland, dropping off orders for strangers. Most of the time, it was the usual routine: ring the doorbell, hand over the bag, get a quick nod and leave. But there was one order that always felt different. It came in every single night, always from the same address in Tremont. The instructions never changed. Leave the food at the door. Do not knock. Do not ring the bell. At first, I didn't think much of it. People had their quirks, and as long as they tipped well, I didn't care. But after a week of these deliveries, something about it started gnawing at me. Every night, I dropped the food at the doorstep and walked away without seeing a single sign of life. No footsteps, no shifting curtains, no hushed voices inside. Just silence. One night, curiosity got the best of me. Instead of driving off right away, I parked a little down the street and kept an eye on the house. Minutes passed. The food sat untouched. A part of me felt silly, but then, just as I was about to leave, the front door creaked open. A man crawled out. He moved in a way that made my stomach twist, his arms dragging his body forward, his legs limp and lifeless. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. The most unsettling thing was his face. His eyes, wide and unblinking, looked empty. No recognition, no urgency. Just a slow, deliberate movement as he reached for the bag and pulled it toward him. I sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel. He paused for a moment, then turned his head slightly in my direction. Even from where I was, I could feel the weight of his gaze. A cold wave of dread crawled up my spine. I didn't wait to see what happened next. My foot slammed the gas pedal and I tore down the street, leaving the house and whatever was inside it far behind. That night I told myself I wouldn't go back. But the next evening the same order popped up on my phone. I stared at the screen for a long time. The same order, the same address. My hands felt clammy as I hesitated, but for some reason I accepted it. Maybe it was a need for answers. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that what I saw wasn't real. On the way there, I did something I should have done days ago. I looked up the address. The first result stopped me cold. 2 years ago, a house fire had ripped through that property, killing a father and his young son. The article mentioned that the place had been demolished shortly after. But that didn't make sense. I had just been there. I had seen the house standing. I felt lightheaded as I pulled onto the familiar street. The GPS insisted I had arrived, but this time the house wasn't there. Where it had once stood, there was nothing but an overgrown lot, weeds creeping over the cracked foundation. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process it. The app still showed the order as active. My phone pinged, a reminder to complete the delivery. I stepped out of the car, my pulse hammering. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fire, no heat. Just a lingering scent, like something burned long ago but never fully faded. I placed the food down where the front porch should have been. The moment I turned to leave, a gust of wind rushed past me, carrying a faint whisper. It wasn't a voice, not really, just a sound, low and raspy, like breath against my ear. The hairs on my arms stood up. I didn't wait. I ran back to the car, slammed the door shut and sped off, my eyes flicking back to the empty lot in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, but I knew something had been watching me. I quit my delivery job that night, deleted the app, wiped the address from my history, and told myself it was over. But the next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the app one last time, scrolling through my completed deliveries. They were all there, except for one. The order from that house was gone. No record of it, no transaction, like it had never existed. I told myself it was just a glitch, but deep down I knew better. Something had happened there, something that didn't belong in this world. Still, I needed closure. So later that day I drove back to the lot in broad daylight. The emptiness was even more unsettling in the sun. No food, no footprints, just weeds and cracked concrete. I turned to leave, but as I reached my car, the wind picked up again. This time the whisper was clearer. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it carried a message. You never stay. My chest tightened. I didn't look back. I got in my car and left, and I never returned to that street again. But sometimes late at night when I least expect it, I swear I still hear that whisper. And no matter how much time passes, I know someone or something is still waiting for me to come back. It had started like any other late-night shift. I had been driving around Chicago, delivering food to impatient customers who barely looked up from their phones when they grabbed their orders. The streets were quiet, the usual mix of neon lights and dark alleyways casting an eerie glow over the city. I had just finished a delivery in Wicker Park when a new order popped up. A large one from an apartment complex in Logan Square. The building was old, the kind of place that had probably been beautiful decades ago, but had since fallen into neglect. Peeling paint, flickering hallway lights, and that faint, musty smell of dust and damp wood. As I stepped into the elevator, the doors shuddered before closing, making me question if I'd even make it to the right floor. When I finally reached the apartment, I knocked twice, shifting the weight of the heavy bag in my arms. The man who opened the door looked normal at first glance. Average height, dark hair, neutral expression. But there was something about his face that made me hesitate. It was a weird feeling, like I had seen him before, but I couldn't place where. His gaze lingered a second too long before he reached for the food. He paid in cash, no tip, then closed the door without a word. I left quickly, brushing off the unease. I had other deliveries to do, but a couple of hours later, another order from the same address popped up on my screen. Different name, same big order. At first, I didn't make the connection. It was late, and I was more focused on getting through the night than on over-analyzing the names on the app. But when I arrived at the same building and knocked, the door opened again, and I felt my stomach drop. It was the same guy, only now he looked different. New clothes, hair slightly changed, as if he had deliberately tried to alter his appearance. But it was him. There was no mistaking it. The way he stared at me, blank-faced but expectant, made my skin crawl. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked away, canceling the order before I even reached the elevator. My hands were shaking as I drove off, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few nights, the orders kept coming. Always from the same apartment, always under different names. At first I tried ignoring them, but every time I checked my app, there it was, another order from that same address. The amounts were always similar, big enough to be suspicious. Who ordered that much food every night? And why did the names keep changing? I mentioned it to one of my co-workers during a quick stop at the restaurant. He glanced at the address and shook his head, said he'd never delivered there, but the building had a reputation. Something about strange tenants, people moving in and out without a trace, rumors of things that had happened there years ago. He didn't know specifics, just that it wasn't a place people stayed for long. That only made it worse. I reported the orders to the food app, explaining that something felt off. They sent back an automated response telling me they'd look into it. That was it. No follow-up, no reassurance, just the same empty words that made me feel like I was on my own. Then, one night, I finished my shift and walked out to my car in the dimly lit parking lot behind the restaurant. The air was thick, the kind of humidity that made the city feel suffocating. I had just unlocked my car when that creeping feeling hit me, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I wasn't alone. Turning slowly, my breath caught in my throat. He was there, standing just beyond the glow of the streetlight, watching me. At first, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearly, the same face, the same unreadable expression. But this time, he wasn't at his apartment door. He was here. He wasn't holding food. He wasn't pretending to be a customer. He was just standing there, waiting. I didn't think. I got in my car, locked the doors, and sped off. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city, checking my mirrors every few minutes, expecting to see headlights trailing me. But there was nothing. No one. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made my pulse jump. My brain kept playing back his face in the parking lot, the way he had just stood there like he knew exactly what he was doing. I knew then that this wasn't over. After that night, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every time I went to work, I scanned the restaurant for unfamiliar faces, checked my mirrors before leaving the parking lot, and avoided taking any orders in Logan Square. The fear clung to me like a shadow, whispering that he could be anywhere, watching, waiting. I updated the food app again, this time sending a detailed report about what had happened. The next morning, I got an email saying the customer had been permanently blocked. They didn't ask for more details. They didn't seem concerned. Just a standard message confirming he wouldn't be placing any more orders. For a few days, the orders stopped. The address disappeared from my screen. I told myself it was over. But the feeling never went away. Some nights I woke up suddenly, heart racing, convinced I had heard something. Footsteps outside my window, a quiet knock at my door. But every time I checked, there was nothing, just silence. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I never saw him again after that night in the parking lot. No more orders, no more sightings, nothing. But the worst part wasn't his absence. It was the lingering fear that he was still out there, that somewhere in the endless sprawl of the city he was waiting watching, and that maybe one day he'd come back.